Hello again, everyone. This is part 3 in the series, the video series Foundations of Literary Study, and the topic of this video will be character. And the content of this presentation aligns with chapter 4 of our textbook, Writing About Literature. So characters. Characters are simply verbal representations of human beings. Sometimes characters are animals in beast fables. There are exceptions, but generally when we're talking about characters, we're talking about verbal representations of human beings. The writer describes their physical attributes, their emotions, behaviors, relationships, manner of speech, and so forth. When a character's thoughts, words, and actions develop into consistent patterns, we call them traits. And traits may be either conscious and deliberate or subconscious and beyond his control. It's important for readers to consider the extent to which a character's traits are innate. That is, part of his internal makeup, or the extent to which those traits are attributable to external circumstances and influences. So when characters display a high degree of complexity, when they evolve or change in the course of the narrative, they are sometimes labeled round characters. And this is a term that goes back to the Bloomsbury writer E.M. Forster, whom I quoted earlier in a previous video from aspects of the novel. He talks about round and flat characters. The main characters in a story are typically round. They are the focus of the reader's interest in the story. If round characters come across to readers as dynamic and authentic, flat characters, by contrast, seem relatively shallow and static. Typically, but not always, their role in the story is peripheral and temporary. They're sometimes disposable characters, but that's not always the case, and I certainly don't think that's the case with some of the flatter characters in Macbeth that we'll talk about later. Characters that display or develop positive traits in the course of a narrative are referred to as heroes. A more neutral word that we use to talk about the main characters in narratives is protagonist. It has less of the kind of grandiosity and expectation that comes with the word hero. So I like the word protagonist, but I also use the word hero from time to time. Characters that display or develop negative traits, often in direct opposition to the protagonist or hero, are called villains or antagonists. Another common type of protagonist is the antihero. And the antihero is one who is prone to failure. The antihero's traits are incompetence, ignorance, and clumsiness. They're often quite funny and bungling, but not always likable. Antiheroes often will provide satirical social comedy, and they can sometimes even elicit sympathy from the reader. Characters sometimes display certain timeless traits associated with a particular class of people or a particular kind of person that most readers will recognize. So think, for example, of the questing hero or prodigal son, the damsel in distress or the cuckolded husband. These characters that display the essential traits of these types are referred to as archetypes. Archetypal characters may be either round or flat, but when they're flat, some readers prefer the term stereotype instead, though that term often carries pejorative connotations. A really good example of archetypes is the general prologue of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. his pilgrims are wonderful examples of archetypal characters. That is William Blake's engraving of the Canterbury Pilgrims, 1810. So let's talk about character in Macbeth. Certain things seem fairly obvious. Clearly, Macbeth's trajectory from battlefield hero in the first scene of Act 1 to a despised tyrant ruler, both of which, by the way, those are two good archetypes. He's the center of our interest in the play, and that makes him the clear protagonist of the play. Obviously, he is a bad man, a destroyed man by the end, but he is the protagonist. Many of the characters around him, including his victims, Duncan and Banquo, can seem tepid and a little flat by comparison to Macbeth. The question of Macbeth's antagonists is an interesting one. There are so many. Is it, for example, the witches that he meets at the beginning? Is it his wife, who basically influences the dominant trait that he develops in the course of the play, this kind of a bloodlust and reckless ambition that propels his violence? Is it Banquo? Is it Malcolm? Certainly, a case could be made for each of these characters to be the antagonist, and there's no reason it couldn't be all of them. I'm going to focus on one scene in particular, and that is scene 7 of Act 5, lines 15 to 57. So the main character, along with Macbeth in this scene, is Macduff. This is the man who was the first person to discover King Duncan's body in Act 2, and he suffers the most at Macbeth's hands, since his wife and children are ruthlessly slaughtered in Act 4. A horrible, horrible scene. It seems logical then that Macduff would be the one to defeat Macbeth in the climactic battle scene. He tells Macbeth, "We'll have thee, as our rarer monsters are, painted upon a pole and underwrit, here may you see the tyrant." And then a few lines later, he enters the stage, Macduff does, carrying Macbeth's head aloft on a pole. But does Macduff's retribution make him a round character? I'll leave that an open question. Certainly, there are many flat or flattish characters in Macbeth. The witches, however instrumental they are to the plot, they're obviously critical. They are conspicuously stereotypical. And despite his overall importance in the play, Banquo does not really display the kind of dynamism that we expect of round characters. One really good example of a flat character, I think, is in the knocking at the gate scene at the beginning of scene 3 in Act 2, lines 1 through 19. One of the more interesting characters because he's funny, he's comical at the darkest moment of the play. Macbeth and his wife have just slaughtered King Duncan and his chamberlains, and they're covered in gore. And there's this knocking at the gate, and they exit the stage, and then the drunken porter stumbles in, and all of a sudden, it's like a funny scene. It's almost jarring, really. He is an example of a flat character. He has one job to do: answer the door, and he does it. And then, having done it, we never see him again. And yet, for the few minutes that he's on stage, he commands our attention with his drunken yammering and his really crass, lewd sense of humor. He's a really compelling character, but he's not a protagonist, and he doesn't really have any depth or change or evolve. He just isn't present for long enough in the play to do that. We can talk about we could talk about Macbeth, I think, as an example of a round character. And I'm going to direct our attention back to Act 5, Scene 5, lines 8 through 15. By this point in the play, by the fifth act, Macbeth he's worn out. He has seen it all. Murder, witches, ghosts, and plenty of gore. He is much changed at this point from the anxious, trepidatious, deeply conflicted man that we encountered earlier in the play, particularly right after Duncan's murder. In this scene, he hears the shrieking of women in his castle. At this point, he's at Dunsinane. And the women have just discovered his wife's body. He doesn't realize that quite yet, but they've just discovered his body. And he says, "I have supped full with horrors. Direness, familiar to my slaughterous thoughts, cannot once start me." So he's no longer affected by horrible things. And that shows how much he's changed in the course of the play as a consequence of the terrible things that he's done. And we'll see more of, there's more of that kind of talk in Act 5, which I will save for future videos. There's one more short speech that I'll mention, and this is actually a couple of scenes earlier, Act 5, Scene 3, lines 19 through 28, where Macbeth sort of recognizes that it's over, that the dream he had of being a king is basically destroyed. This is the "my way of life is fallen into the seer" speech. Even though in Act 5 he continues to fight, he fights to preserve his sovereignty as well as his life, he no longer sees or anticipates any advantage to his position. It's not going to bring him any prestige or extraordinary wealth or appreciation or admiration. Basically, everything he has done, all the atrocities that he has committed, have been for naught, and he realizes it in this really important short speech. So when we talk about character this week, I want you to think about the story Sweat by Zora Neale Hurston. Here are some questions that might drive some of our discussion this week. What are the dominant character traits of Delia and Sykes in Hurston's Sweat? What are some examples of those traits? Where do we see those traits in the story? What gives these characters their depth and complexity? And I guess I guess you should ask, are these characters? I think we can say that Delia is, but Sykes might be more open to debate. How do these characters change or evolve in the course of the story? And what evidence can you find for their roundness? Would you say that either one of these characters, Sykes and Delia, that either one of them is archetypal? Looking at the other characters in the story, would you say any of them are stereotypes, static and flat? What purpose do these other characters serve in the story? How do they help drive the action, the plot of the story? So some questions for Sweat and character. And that concludes this video on character.